The city of Eugene is located in the Willamette Valley, surrounded by the Coast Range, the Cascades, and defined by the Willamette River that flows through it. It's the cultural and demographic core of the state and has been home to people for millennia. The valley has also seen many extensive ecological shifts throughout its history, and the valley of today looks nothing like it did a few generations ago. To learn more about the ecological history of the Willamette Valley, I sat down with Whitey Lueck, a landscape architecture professor who teaches courses like Trees Across Oregon and Nature in Eugene, to explore this topic further. Here's part one of the recorded conversation. What did the Willamette Valley look like during the last ice age?
Well, during the most recent ice age, there was no ice in the valley here. I mean, the closest ice was the ice sheet in the Cascades, and there was no ice in the Coast Range. And so, yet because the climate was cooler and moister back then, there were certainly no Douglas fir here, and no Oregon white oaks, and we have good records through pollen studies of what the vegetation was like during the ice age, and that it was kind of like what we see up at higher elevations on, say, Mount Rainier now. It's what we call a park-like landscape, where you had scattered groves of trees, but in between these little groves were grasses and wildflowers and ferns and whatever else. And so the kind of trees that were on the valley floor here were things like western white pine, mountain hemlock, that now live much higher in the Cascades and to some extent in the Coast Range, that as climate warmed and dried after the ice age was over, they had to move or disappear. And then all this grass in between. I mean, the valley was covered with this charismatic megafauna, mastodons and mammoths and giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats and giant bison that are now extinct and so forth. They were grazers because the Willamette Valley was dominated by grass during the ice age.
The Missoula floods also had a pretty big impact on the characteristics of the valley.
Sure, yeah, I didn't get into that. During the ice age, there were as many as 40 of these floods, and they were of different sizes, but for most of them, this water that came pouring down across eastern Washington and down the Columbia Gorge, down river from Portland, there's a blockage at this gap where all the icebergs and stuff that were in that water would dam up, at least for a short period, and the water would back up into, geologists called it Lake Allison, and that was the lake. It was probably very short-lived, but in the Willamette Valley. And lake waters came, not quite to Eugene. I found rocks near Coburg, not too far from Eugene, that were brought here by icebergs. They're rocks that are from northern Idaho and Montana, and it had to have come in an iceberg, and the iceberg got stranded in the lake here. When the lake went back out, the iceberg melted, and bloop, it popped this rock on top of the Willamette Valley floor. And so in this part of the valley, again, because this was the farthest the lake got, but by the time the water got here, the only particles, fairly small particles, suspended in it. And so when they dropped out, that became this kind of clay layer we have a lot in this part of the valley. The farther north you go, like up where you're from, and I have friends who live in Aurora, that they built a house and they dug down 14 feet. It's 14 feet of all this gorgeous sill loam that was brought in one or maybe a multiple floods. And to the northern part of the valley has phenomenal soil. That's the soil that, we don't, we have good river loam here that came down from the Cascades. That's different. The soil in the northern part of the valley, when the European American settlers started arriving here in the mid-1800s, I can imagine they just must have drooled. It's unbelievable soil. Yeah.
Can you expand on the effect that indigenous cultures in the Willamette Valley had on the ecosystem?
The thing is, the Willamette Valley, ever since the end of the Ice Age, 10,000-ish years ago, it's been inhabited by people. People have been here since maybe as early as 12,000 years ago. One of the animals that lived here was human beings, and one of our favorite tools is the one we brought with us ever since our distant ancestors left Eastern Africa, and that's fire. We like open landscapes, and when landscapes start to fill in, we start burning. And everywhere we've gone, including the tropics, we make clearings for where our houses are, we burn the understory if we can, and that's the kind of landscape we like. And so when the earliest settlers moved in here, and I mean settlers that had crossed over from Asia, they encountered a landscape that was already open. From my perspective, that's what drove this landscape management in the valley here. They burned to keep the landscape open, and whatever plants and animals lived there, their economy came to depend upon. That's just okay. And so, yes, their economy then was based on the foods and animals that this mostly open but diverse landscape provided. So, I mean, there was lots of grassland, but there was also savanna and also woodlands down, especially by the river, denser woodlands. And so their critters, like elk, like to be in the dense woodlands. They were very common here pre-1850, and along with grizzly bears and a lot of other critters that have disappeared.
So that's part one of the conversation. Stay tuned for part two, which will explore how the valley has shifted since Euro-American settlement, current remnants of historic landscapes, and what the future of the Willamette Valley will look like with the effects of climate change. Thanks for watching.